December 20, 1943. 11:32 hours, 27,300 feet above the frozen German countryside near Bremen. The outside air temperature had plunged to minus 60 degrees Celsius. Inside the shattered nose of a dying B-17F Flying Fortress, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown fought to keep his bomber airborne while his crew bled into the aluminum deck plates behind him. Through the gaping holes torn in the fuselage by German cannons, a minus 60-degree gale howled through the aircraft. Engine number 2 was dead. Engine number 4 was dying. The tail gunner was decapitated. Half the crew was wounded or unconscious from oxygen deprivation. And now, pulling alongside his port wing at 200 yards, came a gray Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter, close enough that Brown could see the German pilot's face through the canopy glass. This was the moment that should have ended with 10 American bodies frozen in the wreckage of a burning bomber. Instead, it became something that neither man could explain for 47 years. A choice that defied every rule of total war, that violated Nazi doctrine punishable by execution, and that would haunt both pilots until they found each other nearly half a century later. What makes this encounter extraordinary is not just that it happened, but when it happened. By late 1943, Germany had fully embraced Joseph Goebbels' doctrine of total war. Allied airmen were no longer called pilots in German propaganda. They were terror flyers, murder pilots, air gangsters. The Wehrmacht had banned military burials for Allied aircrew. Civilians were lynching shot-down American pilots with shovels and rocks. Field Marshal Hermann Göring had ordered that captured airmen be turned over to angry mobs. In this environment, showing mercy to an enemy bomber crew was not just against orders, it was treason punishable by firing squad. Yet on December 20, 1943, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe fighter ace named Franz Stigler looked through the torn fuselage of Ye Old Pub and saw not targets but brothers. He touched the rosary beads in his flight jacket pocket and made a decision that would cost him everything except his soul. The mission had begun 6 hours earlier at Royal Air Force Kimballton in Cambridgeshire, England. At 0940 hours, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown, 21 years old but claiming 25 to impress his crew, led his 10-man team on their first combat mission. The target was the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft production facility at Bremen, 37 miles inland from Germany's North Sea coast. Brown commanded B-17F serial number 423167, christened Ye Old Pub, assigned to the 527th Bombardment Squadron, 379th Bombardment Group Heavy. This was 8th Bomber Command Mission 159. The strike force consisted of 546 heavy bombers, with 225 in Brown's first element alone. They faced Bremen's 250-plus flak guns manned by elite officer candidate school gunners and defended by hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters. Brown and his crew were flying in what veterans grimly called Purple Heart Corner, the most exposed and vulnerable position in the formation. Brown's crew that morning consisted of Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke as co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Albert Sadok as navigator, Second Lieutenant Robert Andrews as bombardier, Sergeant Bertrand Colombe as top turret gunner and flight engineer, Sergeant Richard Peychaud as radio operator, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode as tail gunner, Sergeant Lloyd Jennings as left waist gunner, Sergeant Alex Yelisanko as right waist gunner, and Sergeant Samuel Blackford as ball turret gunner. 10 men. Their first combat mission. Most would not survive to see their second. At 11:32 hours, having climbed to 27,300 feet, where the outside air temperature plunged to minus 60 degrees Celsius, Ye Old Pub began its straight 30-mile bomb run toward Bremen. Brown later described what he saw as they approached the target. About 2 minutes before bombs away, immediately in front of us, I saw what appeared to be fantastically beautiful black orchids with vivid crimson centers. The flak had found them. A red flash exploded directly in the plexiglass nose, shattering it completely and creating a howling minus 60-degree gale through the bomber. Engine number 2 on the inboard left wing died instantly. Engine number 4 on the outboard right had to be throttled back to prevent overspeeding. The bomber gave what Brown called a big kick as its 12 500-pound bombs dropped on the smoking target below. Mission accomplished. But Ye Old Pub was already dying. What happened next transformed a damaged bomber into a flying coffin. Unable to maintain formation speed on two failing engines, Ye Old Pub fell behind as a straggler. In 1943, United States Army Air Forces surveys showed that over 50% of bombers shot down had left formation. Now Ye Old Pub was alone, limping through hostile skies at reduced speed and altitude. A perfect target, dark gray shapes materialized on the horizon. A squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s closing fast, followed by Messerschmitt Bf 109s leaping through clouds from below. For more than 10 minutes, 12 to 15 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 11, Fighter Wing 11, executed coordinated attacks on the crippled fortress. Brown turned into the attackers, presenting the narrowest target profile and disrupting their aim. His top turret gunner hit one FW-190 that banked off trailing fire. But the Bf-109s closed from behind where tail gunner Eckenrode's guns had frozen solid in the -60-degree winds. 20mm cannon shells punched through the thin aluminum fuselage. Engine number 3 was hit, reduced to half power. Half the rudder was shot away. The port elevator was destroyed. The oxygen system failed. The hydraulic system died. The electrical system failed. The radio disintegrated into static. Most critically, the tail section was shot to pieces, and Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode was decapitated by a direct cannon hit. Of 11 defensive guns, only 3 remained operational. 2 in the dorsal turret and 1 in the nose. The morphine syrettes were frozen solid. Sergeant Alex Yelasanko had been critically wounded in the leg by shrapnel. Sergeant Richard Peshout took a cannon shell fragment in the eye. Sergeant Samuel Blackford's feet were freezing from shorted-out heating wires. Charlie Brown had a bullet fragment lodged in his right shoulder. Nearly everyone in the rear compartment was incapacitated by wounds, cold, or oxygen deprivation. The bomber that had once generated 4,800 horsepower from 4 Wright Cyclone engines now operated at roughly 40% power. Engine number 1 at full power. Engine number 3 at half power. Engines 2 and 4 effectively dead. But it was the oxygen deprivation that nearly killed them all. Brown's vision faded. The world narrowed to a gray tunnel. The bomber tipped left and began spiraling out of control. While reversing a steep turn, Ye Old Pub went fully inverted, upside down, and Brown passed out completely. The fortress plunged from 27,300 feet in an uncontrolled spin toward the city of Oldenburg below. At approximately 1,000 feet above ground, close enough to see individual houses in Oldenburg, Brown regained consciousness. He hauled on the controls with all his remaining strength and pulled the bomber out of its death dive just above the rooftops. Achieving level flight at barely 135 miles per hour, Brown turned south, unknowingly flying deeper into Germany toward the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall coastal defenses. He had no idea where he was. Most of his crew was unconscious or dying. His bomber was shredded, and he was flying at treetop level directly over a Luftwaffe fighter base. Oberfeldwebel Franz Ludwig Stigler stood on the ground at Fliegerhorst Oldenburg, Air Base Oldenburg, as his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 was refueled and rearmed. Born August 21, 1915 in Amberg, Bavaria, the 28-year-old pilot had logged over 2,000 hours as a civilian Lufthansa pilot before the war. His father had been a World War I pilot. Franz had started flying gliders at age 12. He had studied to become a Catholic priest before choosing aviation, and he carried rosary beads in his flight jacket pocket at all times. Stigler had joined the Luftwaffe in 1940 as an instructor, but after his older brother August, also a pilot, was killed in October 1940 when his Junkers Ju-88 crashed on takeoff for a bombing mission to London, Franz volunteered for frontline combat duty. He had served with Jagdgeschwader 27, Fighter Wing 27, in North Africa, Sicily, and now in the defense of the Reich. He had logged 487 combat missions and been shot down 17 times himself. He had bailed out 6 times and crash-landed 11 times. He had been wounded 4 times. By December 20, 1943, Franz Stigler had 27 confirmed victories. He had already shot down 2 B-17s earlier that very morning. One more bomber kill would give him 30 points, bombers counted for 3 points each, and earn him the Ritterkreuz des Eisernen Kreuzes, the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest valor decoration. He was 1 kill away from joining the elite of German fighter aces. His Bf-109 was already damaged from that morning's combat, with a .50 caliber bullet lodged in the radiator, risking engine overheating. But when he spotted a heavily damaged B-17 flying low overhead, trailing smoke and barely maintaining altitude, Stigler quickly scrambled and took off. This would be easy. His 28th kill, the Knight's Cross, would be his. His commander in North Africa, Oberstleutnant Gustav Rodel, a '98 victory ace himself, had drilled into his pilots a code that transcended tactics. You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Rodel had taught Stigler that honor is everything, and that you follow the rules of war for you, not your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity. Stigler's Bf-109G6 was one of Germany's most formidable fighters, with its 1,475 horsepower Daimler-Benz DB605A inverted V12 engine. The 109 could reach 428 miles per hour at optimal altitude with a service ceiling of 39,000 feet. Armament typically included two 13mm MG-131 machine guns synchronized through the propeller arc and one 20mm MG-151 cannon firing through the propeller hub. It was fast, agile, and deadly, perfect for finishing off a crippled bomber limping along at 135 miles per hour. Stigler approached from behind and below, standard attack position. He positioned himself for the kill shot, lining up the wounded bomber in his gun sights. His finger rested on the trigger. Then he noticed something. The tail gunner's guns never moved. Flying closer for a better look, Stigler suddenly saw through the massive holes torn in the fuselage by flak and cannon fire. He could see inside. The frantic crew was trying to save wounded comrades. Blood covered the interior. The tail gunner was slumped over his guns, clearly dead. This was not a fortress anymore. It was a coffin that was still somehow flying. Stigler later said it was the most heavily damaged aircraft I ever saw that was still flying. The entire nose was missing, exposing the crew to the elements. Control surfaces were shot away. The aircraft was struggling to maintain altitude. More than half the engines were dead or dying. Rodel's words echoed in Stigler's mind. If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Stigler made his assessment. To me, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them, and I could not shoot them down. His hand went to the pocket of his flight jacket and touched the rosary beads within. Years later he would confess, I cannot kill these half-dead people. It would be like shooting at a parachute. This will be no victory for me. I will not have this on my conscience for the rest of my life. At approximately 12:15 hours, Stigler pulled up alongside Ye Old Pub's port wing and drew level with the cockpit. Brown's eyes were fixed on the horizon ahead, thinking about the coastal flak guns he would have to face. Suddenly he noticed the gray Messerschmitt right beside him, close enough to see the pilot's face. Brown later recalled, I closed my eyes and shook my head. If I close my eyes and open them again, he will be gone. I opened them again, and he was still there. Co-pilot Pinky Luke gasped, My God, this is a nightmare. Stigler waved at Brown and pointed down, signaling they should land at a German airfield below. Brown shook his head, refused. It was not bravery. Brown later admitted it was probably stupidity. Stigler then gestured toward Sweden, the neutral country where the crew would receive medical treatment and be interned but safe. Brown and his crew did not understand the hand signals and mouthing. Brown was determined to reach England or die trying. Realizing the Americans would not land, Stigler made a decision that went far beyond not shooting them down. He would actively protect them. He took position in close formation on the bomber's port wing and signaled them to turn north, away from deeper Germany, toward the coast. Brown eventually understood and turned northward toward the North Sea. For approximately 15 to 20 minutes, Stigler flew escort, positioned so that German spotters on the ground would clearly see his Bf-109. The strategy was deliberate. Experienced German anti-aircraft gunners would recognize one of their own and hold their fire. They approached the Atlantic Wall, the heavily fortified German coastline, guarded by the best anti-aircraft gunners in the world. German spotters easily recognized Stigler's distinctive Bf-109 silhouette. Not a single flak gun opened fire. Brown could not understand why they passed unscathed. Stigler wondered his whole life what those spotters thought of the scene. A German fighter escorting a dying American bomber to safety. Brown, still unsure of Stigler's intentions, ordered his dorsal turret gunner to aim guns at the German fighter but commanded, "Do not open fire." It was a warning shot, a way to warn Stigler off. Stigler understood the message. They still had claws. Over the North Sea, well beyond German airspace, Stigler flew near Brown's plane one final time. He looked directly at Brown, raised his hand in salute, then rolled over and disappeared, banking back toward Germany. Brown watched, finally understanding what the German pilot had done for them. Ahead lay 250 miles of storm-tossed North Sea and the desperate struggle to keep the bomber airborne with 3 seriously wounded men and most systems dead. What Franz Stigler had done was a capital crime in Nazi Germany, punishable by execution. By December 1943, Germany had fully embraced Joseph Goebbels' doctrine of total war, declared in his infamous Sportpalast speech of February 18, 1943, just 10 months earlier. Goebbels had systematically demonized Allied airmen, eliminating words like pilot from official vocabulary and substituting terror, flyer, murder flyers, and air gangsters. On December 22, 1943, just 2 days after Stigler's act of mercy, Goebbels wrote in his diary that Germany should make it a legal process to condemn shot-down Anglo-American murder pilots to death. The Wehrmacht had banned military burials for Allied airmen in July 1943. In August 1943, Heinrich Himmler ordered SS and police not to intervene in confrontations between civilians and downed Allied airmen, a de facto license to kill. British and American authorities later documented at least 2,462 Allied airmen lynched or abused by German civilians in their occupation zones, with 1,015 killed. These were not exceptions. By 1944, they were the norm. The Russelsheim massacre in August 1944 saw 6 American B-24 crew members beaten to death with rocks, hammers, sticks, and shovels. An entire B-17 crew was beaten to death with shovels at Borkum. Stigler had not merely refrained from shooting down an enemy aircraft, he had actively escorted it to safety, preventing German anti-aircraft batteries from firing. He had given up his opportunity for the Knight's Cross. He had aided the enemy in a state where mercy had become treason. If discovered, he would face execution. He never told his superiors. He carried the secret for 47 years, telling absolutely no one during the war, not his fellow pilots, not his commanders, not his friends. Even decades later, after the story became public, some German veterans called him a traitor to Germany. When the bomber force landed at Royal Air Force Seething, Station 146, in Norfolk, England, 10 miles southeast of Norwich, it arrived as what one witness called a smoking pile of exhausted men and shredded aluminum. The aircraft had crossed 250 miles of open water at barely 250 feet altitude. They could not climb higher, maintaining only 135 miles per hour. 1 engine at full power, 1 at half power, 2 dead. The crew had discussed bailing out but rejected it because Yelisenko could not make a safe parachute landing with his leg wound. At the post-flight debriefing, Brown informed his officers about the German fighter pilot who let them go. The incredulous debriefing officer initially recommended Brown's crew for citation, but High Command furiously classified the mission details as secret and ordered Brown and his crew never to discuss the incident with anyone. Officials feared that stories of chivalrous German pilots could prove dangerous, potentially causing other flight crews to let their guard down. Brown was explicitly told not to repeat the story to the rest of the unit. As Brown bitterly noted years later, someone decided you cannot be human and be flying in a German cockpit. The official stance became, the mission never happened. Unfortunately, no photographs exist of the aircraft in its damaged state. It never flew combat again. It was sent to Base Air Depot 2 at Wharton on April 4. 1944, returned to the United States on April 16, 1944, and was scrapped at Altus, Oklahoma on August 11, 1945. Charlie Brown completed his combat tour, flying until April 11, 1944, and survived the war. He returned to West Virginia, went to college, rejoined the newly established United States Air Force in 1949, and served until 1965. He then worked as a United States State Department Foreign Service officer with numerous trips to Laos and Vietnam before retiring from government service in 1972 and moving to Miami, Florida, to become an inventor. But the war had cast a shadow over his soul. His daughter later recalled, "I remember him having terrible wartime nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat every now and again." For over 40 years, Brown wondered about the identity of the German pilot. Franz Stigler continued flying fighters throughout the war, eventually transitioning to the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter with Jagdverband 44, the elite squadron of experts commanded by General Adolf Galland, in February 1945. He flew 16 combat missions in the Me-262. His total career record was 487 combat missions, 26 to 28 confirmed victories, shot down 17 times, wounded 4 times. He never received the Knight's Cross. After December 20, 1943, he had lost his appetite for it. He later stopped claiming individual victories and often gave credit to younger pilots to boost their confidence. After the war, Stigler moved to Canada in 1953, worked as an auto mechanic with a logging company, became a successful businessman, bought a Messerschmitt 108 painted as his Bf 109, and played the villain at air shows. In 1986, when asked at the gathering of the Eagles reunion at Maxwell Air Force Base if he had any memorable missions, Brown recalled the story. He decided he should try to find the unknown German pilot and spent 4 years searching through United States Army Air Forces, United States Air Force, and West German Air Force records with little success. Brown wrote a letter to a Combat Pilot Association newsletter describing the incident. The editor of Jägerblatt, Association of German Fighter Pilots newsletter, initially refused to publish Charlie Brown's letter searching for Stigler, until Adolf Galland personally ordered him to publish it. On January 18, 1990, Brown received a response letter from Vancouver, Canada. It simply said, "I was the one." The letter was from Franz Stigler. When they spoke on the phone, Stigler described his plane, the escort, the salute, and specific battle damage details that Brown had not mentioned in his letter, confirming everything. Stigler wrote, "Dear Charles, all these years I wondered what happened to that B-17. Did she make it home? Did her crew survive their wounds? To hear of your survival has filled me with indescribable joy." On June 21, 1990, in Seattle, Washington, they met in person for the first time since that December day 47 years earlier. A friend brought a video camera to capture the moment. In the video, an emotional Stigler is seen fighting back tears as he greets Brown. His first words were, "I love you, Charlie." Stigler later described it as being like meeting a family member, like a brother you have not seen for 40 years. They grabbed each other and hugged immediately. Brown's nightmares about the war finally stopped after meeting Franz. For 18 years, from 1990 until both died in 2008, they were as close as brothers. Living remarkably close, Stigler in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Brown in Seattle, Washington, less than 200 miles apart, they visited each other at least twice a year, went fishing together regularly, traveled across the country to tell their story at air shows, schools, and veterans reunions. Their wives became friends. Brown constantly worried about Stigler's health and checked in on him regularly. On September 13, 1990, Stigler was invited as guest of honor to the 379th Bomb Group reunion in Massachusetts, where he was made an honorary member. 25 descendants, children and grandchildren of the crew members, were present that day, all owing their lives to Stigler's decision. From one account, from above, it must have looked funny. The circle of people crowding around one small man in the center, hugging him, and one another amid sounds of tears and laughter. But everyone that day owed something to Franz Stigler, the man in the middle. Ball turret gunner Blackie Blackford sobbed and thanked Franz for allowing his children and grandchildren to experience life. In a book he gave to Brown before his death, Stigler wrote an inscription. In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December 1943, 4 days before Christmas, I had the chance to save a B-17 from her destruction, a plane so badly damaged it was a wonder that she was still flying. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz. Franz Stigler died March 22, 2008 in Vancouver, British Columbia, at age 92. Charlie Brown died November 24, 2008 in Miami, Florida at age 86, just 8 months later. Following a request from Brown before his death, the crew members each received the Silver Star, many posthumously, and Brown himself was awarded the Air Force Cross in 2008, the nation's second highest Valor Award. No other World War II aircrew has been collectively honored in this manner. In 2003, military historian Adam Makos began researching the story after multiple World War II veterans kept asking him, "Do you know the story of the German fighter pilot who let the American B-17 escape?" When Makos called Brown insisted he first meet Franz. "You cannot interview me until I first talked with my older brother, the German fighter pilot Franz Stigler." Makos spent 9 years researching and conducting more than 50 hours of interviews with both pilots and surviving crew members. The result was a higher call, an incredible true story of combat and chivalry in the war-torn skies of World War II, published in 2012, which became a New York Times bestseller and appeared on the United States Air Force Chief of Staff's recommended reading list in 2014. The story gained worldwide attention. A CBS News segment filmed at the 1990 reunion showed the emotional encounter. In 2013, the NCIS television series aired an episode inspired by the incident. In 2014, Swedish heavy metal band Sabaton wrote the song No Bullets Fly about the encounter for their album Heroes. In 2019, a surviving B-17G, serial number 448543, operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection, was repainted as Ye Old Pub and now flies at air shows, providing historic flight experiences. But the story also generated controversy. Even decades after the war, when it became public, Franz received calls from Germany, calling him a traitor for sparing the bomber. Some Canadian neighbors shunned him as a Nazi bastard, though he was never a member of the Nazi Party and came from an anti-Nazi family where both parents voted against Hitler. Stigler's simple response to his critics was, "They would never understand." By December 20, 1943, Franz Stigler's act of mercy was extraordinary not because it was good, but because it was nearly impossible. The Luftwaffe, despite maintaining some traditions from World War I's Knights of the Air, was by late 1943 fighting a desperate war of survival under a totalitarian regime that had systematically dismantled any distinction between combatants and criminals. The incident occurred during the most brutal phase of the air war. In October 1943, just 2 months earlier, the second Schweinfurt raid, Black Thursday, had seen 60 B-17s shot down over Germany out of 291 attacking, with 77 total losses including write-offs, a 26% loss rate so devastating that daylight raids were temporarily suspended. The Battle of Berlin raged from November 1943 to March 1944, with Royal Air Force Bomber Command making 16 massed attacks with over 800 bombers per night, suffering more than 600 planes downed and 2,700 flyers killed. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe had only 1,200 survivors of the original 28,000 pilots, a 96% attrition rate. While there were other documented cases of mercy between enemies, British and German pilots helping each other survive in Norway in 1940, post-war reunions between North Africa veterans, these almost exclusively occurred in 1940 to 1942. By late 1943, such acts had become extraordinarily rare. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was noted as exceptional because he insisted troops give prisoners the same treatment as German officers and refused orders to execute prisoners. The Stigler-Brown incident was described by historians as probably unique at that time in the air war over Europe. What makes this story resonate across generations is not that it offers a comfortable narrative about good Germans or simplistic moral lessons. It is brutally honest about the context. Stigler's Germany was committing genocide, bombing civilian populations, and executing prisoners. The Luftwaffe, despite its relative professionalism compared to the SS, was deeply involved in Nazi war crimes. Brown's America would go on to firebomb Dresden and drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was not a war between good guys and bad guys. This was total war where both sides systematically dehumanized the enemy. Yet in that context, one man touched his rosary beads and chose his humanity over his medal, his career, possibly his life. Another man held fire when he could have shot down the German fighter escorting them. Brown later told author Makos, "In this story, I am just a character. Franz Stigler is the real hero." But Stigler insisted the opposite. The truth is, they both made choices. Small human choices in circumstances designed to make such choices impossible. Franz Stigler never received the Knight's Cross. He was one kill away from earning. Charlie Brown spent 40 years with nightmares before finding peace. 10 men on Ye Old Pub made it home that day, minus Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode killed in action, and 25 descendants existed by 1990 because one German pilot decided that there is something worse than death, and one of those things is to completely lose your humanity. The last surviving crew member, Sergeant Lloyd Jennings, left waist gunner, died in 2016 at age 94. The story lives on not as propaganda or sentimentality, but as testimony to the stubborn persistence of individual moral choice, even in the most extreme circumstances of total war. As Stigler himself explained his philosophy, "You follow the rules of war for you, not your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity." On December 20, 1943, at 27,000 feet over Germany, keeping his humanity cost Franz Stigler everything except his soul. And 47 years later, it gave him back his brother. In the Valley of Fire over Bremen, courage met conscience, and conscience chose mercy. Two enemies became brothers because one man saw through the propaganda to the humanity beneath. And in a war designed to make such recognition impossible, that simple act of seeing another human being and refusing to kill him became the most revolutionary act of all,